to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we're returning to Brad Bird. We just cannot let this man go. We love him so much, or something like that. I don't know, man. It's fucking cut this bit. Good. It's Incredibles 2.
It sure is.
We watched it in theaters. And 15 years later, it could have been worse.
It was a Pixar sequel for pretty much all that entails. A non-Toy Story Pixar sequel, I should say. Because those are a little different. But yes, for better or worse, this most certainly was a Pixar sequel. And what do I mean by that exactly? Because we talked a little bit about this before, about kind of the crop of Pixar nostalgia sequels like Monsters University and Finding Dory, that are basically the same movie as the first one, but with some new jokes and updated animation, which is basically what Finding Dory was. Monsters University is a little different, which is why I think it probably works the best out of all of these. But yeah, if you liked The Incredibles and you want more character interactions and you want more wacky superhero stuff, and you want to just have an enjoyable family film that'll hold your attention and be pretty well made for a 2-hour runtime, this'll do ya. This'll have you covered. If you want something that has the same sort of thematic concerns and just sort of I don't know if teeth is the right word, grit maybe as the first one, that even makes it sound too heart might be the best word.
Teeth, heart, they're the same thing when it comes to movies. What are you talking about?
I mean, they kind of are. They're not totally unrelated. It doesn't have quite the same spark. Doesn't have quite the same edge. Doesn't have quite the same. It is very much a nostalgia sequel. So
it is a light version of the first, I think, is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, Incredibles light.
And that's not... I'm pretty much going to agree with Jackson. That's not necessarily entirely a bad thing. There were still a lot of moments in this movie that I really liked. I still laughed through it quite a bit. Character beats were all really good and fun still, if not a little abrupt at points. But, it never overstayed its welcome by any means. It just didn't have any sort of thematic through line that the first one did. I believe it was David Ehrlich on Twitter. I might be getting this confused with somebody else, but I think it was, who basically described it as Brad Bird stuck his hand in a bag of themes, chucked it at the wall. A couple of them stuck for a little while, but eventually peeled off, and we ultimately got left with kind of a half soggy, half baked theme that didn't really have any gumption behind it. It just kind of was there.
Not so much themes, but the residue of themes from where they once were.
Yeah, it's like when you take a sticker off and you get that gross stuff on the back, where it was. That's kind of what we ended up with. What at one point might have been an idea got peeled off and just kind of left what was left to do what it had to do. Which honestly is kind of how I ended up feeling about a lot of this movie. It not only is it does that work in the sense that it is Incredibles light, it is the residue of the first Incredibles, but it felt like a lot more of it was reactionary rather than actionary. Because I'll get a little bit more into this later, but it kind of felt more like a response to criticism of the first movie in a lot of ways. Not necessarily in any real big ways. It's not like, wow, look at this shitty animation so that we made it better or anything like that. More of like in response to theme and whatnot. And if you listen to our episode on the first Incredibles, you'll kind of get a sense of what I mean by theme in the first movie and how they kind of played with it in the second movie, and the idea of how they handle death in both of them, because it definitely feels like one is a response to the other, where it kind of got defanged, to use Jackson's teeth thing he's got going on today.
I do not have a teeth thing. No, I think that's a pretty good summary. I guess the last thing I want to say before we actually start talking about like the plot and spoilers is that I've heard the comparison of it feeling more like a sitcom at times, and I sort of agree with that, but I don't necessarily think of it as a bad thing, and how that sort of critique is usually leveled at movies. In this case, just because some of the sitcom-y stuff was some of the most enjoyable stuff in the movie for me. So basically, are you the sort of person who would have enjoyed an Incredibles cartoon had it come out, like an animated series of just like family stuff plus superhero stuff? This feels like a very long episode of a theoretical Incredibles cartoon to me.
I could see this being like a successful mini-series, kind of like a Gravity Falls type thing going on in a lot of ways. Just because it kind of got like a lot of the similar humor behind it, similar, like it could have a lot of deeper themes to it, some adult situations in it, throw it on like Disney XD or whatever. Very much Gravity Falls-esque. So I definitely see where this could have been made into a very interesting series, especially because with all of the lesser themes in it and whatnot, like especially because like I said, it took a handful of themes, and like if you made each one of those in an individual episode, you might have a little bit more of a coherent idea behind it.
Yeah, like there's enough in there's enough of each sort of theme to fill like a 30-minute runtime, and then they just sort of run out and move on to the next one.
Because like there are whole scenes, there's a whole theme, a whole scene early on that I'm like, it ran for maybe 5 minutes, and like it seems like it got resolved in 30 seconds. I'm like, I thought that was gonna be like the plot of the movie, like I thought this was gonna be the dramatic through line. And instead it just kind of gets resolved. And like with the idea of it being a sitcom, it makes a lot more sense. Had it been 20 minutes instead of 5 and just ended there, and we would have moved on to the next bit of drama and whatnot. Because it did ultimately feel like a sitcom resolution. We're just like, oh, honey, I get it. And then they're all happy. And then everywhere you go, everywhere you look.
Oh, God. All right, do we want to move into fucking spoilers?
Yeah, so let's talk about spoilers for Fuller House.
The real nostalgia reboot that we were all waiting for.
I've been hankering for some Fuller House for a long time, and I feel like it really delivered on this one. I am going to take just a quick second and put my significant other on blast for a minute, because she has watched the entirety of Fuller House.
Man, you are just leaving her out to dry in public. Well, like you are like hoisting her like for the world to see.
Let me contextualize this, because it's not as bad as it sounds. Because when she's doing her morning routine and whatnot, she'll have it on in the background just to listen to his background noise. So it's not like I sat down and watched it with a pizza and a beer one Friday night. It took her like a couple months to get through it, because God help anyone who watches it. I would walk past and like my soul would get sucked out from the 30 seconds of it I heard. It sounded so bizarre and trite, and there's this whole like Japanese wedding episode when I walked by, I'm just like, oh no, why are you watching this? What is happening?
Kill me! Kill me!
So yeah, that ends our discussion on Fuller House. Let's talk about Incredibles 2.
Let's talk about Incredibles 2. Yeah, wow. Japanese wedding episode. So there is no Japanese wedding episode of The Incredibles 2.
Of the movie, but there might be of the show.
We don't know,
and we may never know.
So
Edna Mary's Dash. I ran into a problem where I couldn't come up with any other characters that were unmarried except for the children, and I was originally going to go with Jack Jack, but I realized that was even worse than Dash. So I just kind of rolled with it.
He's got to roll with the punches sometimes. So speaking of marriages, let's talk a little bit more about what you were sort of alluding to with that plot point, because the movie's got a good hook. It starts off with directly from the last scene, the last frame of the last movie, with the Incredibles fighting the Underminer, which was very surprising and kind of weird. Not necessarily in a bad way, but like I remember feeling kind of like, oh whoa, like we're gonna like resolve this. Like this just felt like another Monster of the Week sort of in the Adventure Continues kind of ending. I didn't think we'd get a resolution to this. But not that it's a bad thing.
It was kind of cute. Like it played into the setup of the rest of the movie and everything like that. So I did kind of like it, but I do get what you mean by it being a little weird and jarring.
Yeah, and it's less, and plus it functionally, it serves the same purpose that the 50s, the like pre-Super Legislation Act scenes in the first movie do, and that there's got to be a catastrophe so that the people are mad at the supers. And it's kind of weird in the context of this movie, because in theory people should already be mad at the supers, but then the ending of the first movie made you feel like people weren't mad at the supers anymore, so you have to reestablish that they are. Whatever. Structurally, the movie is identical to the first.
Oh my god, yeah. Watching this opening scene, I'm like, this is just a remake of the first movie.
Yeah, a feeling that would not lift through the rest of it, because it's very much the same domestic life, superhero intrigue, plot split. You have the kids have their little side plots. Then eventually they get involved in the action. You know, Mr. and Mrs. Incredibles roles are switched. Right,
Dash once again still has no real plot through line of any sort.
No. Even less so this time, I dare say.
Oh yeah, he's like just kind of there to run quick.
Yeah, the Quickster. So yeah, the Quickster doesn't have anything to do. Violet, it's funny because they have to backpedal on her. You know, it seems like she's got her confidence, and so now she's gonna have her little like middle school date. But he has to get like mind wiped, and that has to be a big thing so she can go back to being awkward.
A woman had too much competence. Better put her back in her box.
Yeah, no. So she has to go back to being. She's a little different. I do appreciate that she wasn't the exact same like shrinking Violet. That she was just a lot more like coming into conflict in like kind of a teenagery way, and like that's sort of the domestic sitcom stuff that I think worked pretty well in the movie. But what we end up having though is the main hook that's different is that instead of midlife crisis Mr. Incredible running off on his adventure, you have Elastigirl being chosen for the initial round of pro-superhero propaganda, basically. She's gonna go do missions and, you know, try and get superheroes looking good in the public eye again. And that's a good hook. That's some nice theoretical interesting conflict, some splits in their marriage. That was, again, the best part of the first movie, was sort of their relationship and how serious it felt in the context of like a family animated movie.
I will say, just really as a quick aside, now that you mention this, like, I would have really liked to have seen a little bit more like 50s style propaganda throughout this. Just because I love 50s style propaganda posters and whatnot, and I'm a little disappointed I don't think we saw any.
Did you feel like the setting in general was much less strong in this one? Because I did.
Yeah, it didn't have that same aesthetic. Like, it had the same aesthetic, but not the same time period aesthetic.
Like I feel like we lost a lot by moving the Incredibles into that like McMansion, just because I think that part of the charm of the first one's like family drama was that they lived in like the like picturesque like suburban nuclear family house. Like, you know, it was, everything was steeped in that sort of like Cold War you know, conspicuous consumption sort
of. It really
of
grounded you in the 50s, and this movie never had that moment where it reinvigorated that idea.
Because they focus so much more on the sci-fi angle of it, and like all the gadgets and like the house, because everyone is sort of rich and fancy, and then the villain, I guess Syndrome was pretty tech-based too, but it didn't feel as incongruous, whereas with the Screenslaver, it almost feels more like a villain more appropriate for the internet age. I know that like the 60s would have been like the big, by then like everyone would have a TV in their house, and like that's the beginning of sort of the media cycle. But I feel like you're right, I would want more like 50s style propaganda. I think that would help sell that idea, that aesthetic of like, this is the dawn of control through mass media, and like this is that time period. But instead it just feels it just feels sort of not grounded in any particular setting. This feels like it could take place anytime.
Yeah, we never really get like that. And have you been assaulted today by a supervillain? Come talk to the Supervillain Awareness Registration Act. Bring back the supers. We never get like any voice, like 50s voice stuff like that going on. It's just always, we don't even get any ads. Like, as much as this is about propaganda, there's just never anything with that in it. There's a couple scenes where she's like talking to somebody on the news, but it's never like, I want those ads.
It's weird, like in hindsight, just because of rewatching The Iron Giant, rewatching The Incredibles, that usually he's so good at those details. And I don't know if they just weren't a priority, or if he just didn't want to do like the same thing again. I mean, the movie's doing the same thing again in a lot of other ways, but this is, you know, a detail that would have really helped with the world building. So I don't know. But yeah, I agree that we needed more of a play up of that, like your image is controlled through the media, through ads, through propaganda, because as it is, it feels like it almost feels like, to me, because the conflict between Bob and Helen never really becomes a conflict in their marriage like it did in the first one. It feels like it just exists because, well, okay, I guess we'll have Elastigirl be driving the action this time, so we can have some scenes of Bob being a wacky guy, not able to control the baby. Won't that be funny? And it is funny. But it feels like we could have gotten some substantial, like, character drama out of that, as well as just some yokes, you know?
Yeah, for sure. But let's now that we've like segued away for 5-10 minutes, let's jump back into the initial point of like where the theming kind of falls apart. and like that scene of the drama and everything like that. This actually is a good way to segue back into it, and it probably would have been more natural had I not brought attention to the fact that we hadn't talked about it for several minutes. But here we are now, and I've spoken for too long that this is not getting edited out.
We can't take it back, people. I mean, we could, but we won't.
That's a lot of effort, and like I'm already doing like so much for this. Like I tweet every other day, maybe.
Patreon.com/beating a dead horse. Just give us money.
But yeah, so like that setup of the idea that like there's marital conflict, it just plays very much into the first one, but also never gets explained in the same way. Like that lasts throughout the entirety of the first movie, and like they even make jokes about it. Like the worst thing that could happen to mom and dad is they get a divorce, and like that's a running theme throughout that movie. And in this one, there's like one scene where Bob's like, I'm mad that Helen is getting to do this, and like I'm talking to Helen about it because this is a healthy relationship and we're having this conversation and I'm clearly disgruntled, and like this feels like it should pay off into like the longer run as he gets more and more upset and whatnot, but instead it just kind of ends there, and there's a quick mention of it later on, but that's about it.
And so like I can see why they didn't lean too as much into that as maybe it seems natural to do so, because I know that when you're making a sequel to a movie that very much centered on this kind of character conflict, these kind of misunderstandings, miscommunications, when the previous movie ends in those miscommunications being kind of resolved, it can feel sort of cheap to go back to. It can start to feel like bickering if you do the same thing again without as much substance. Because that was the thing that that I don't know if we actually said this in the last podcast, but one of my feelings on the first one is that when Violet says that divorce line, it's a joke, but it also kind of isn't, because that at that point is one of the central tensions of the movie, which is one of the first movie's great strengths. And here, on the one hand, it's good that they don't completely rehash that, but the problem is, A, there's so much that they're rehashing already, and B, having this particular conflict feels like a natural extension of the first one that wouldn't necessarily undermine any growth or resolution that happened in the first one, because there's like the gender dynamics of, you know, Bob not being seen as like the provider, as like the superhero anymore, and like having to deal with that as just all this other stuff that feels like it could be a nice complication that wouldn't just be the same thing again. And yet, what we do end up getting does feel like kind of a regression. Or maybe not so much of a regression, but I don't know, something about Mr. Incredible in this movie. I guess the fact that just in full goofball mode, he feels like a different character to me than the last one.
In a lot of ways, because as like even in that moment where he gets like there's like a little mini temper tantrum, it felt like weirdly out of character. Like I always get the idea that he was more supportive of his wife, and like this idea of her going out to make the world better for everyone and like letting him come back out of retirement and whatnot. Like I would understand like underlying jealousy and whatnot, but like I don't envision him ever being that open and outward with it. And like I could see it more like all right, I get it, we kind of like see it through the movie as he kind of like wrestles with it internally, because like he'd be more aware of like this needs to happen, I understand why, I respect my wife, I will let her do this, but also it just felt really out of character for him in that moment.
Out of character, especially for someone whose character arc in the first movie was to be less of a self-centered asshole, you know? And the fact that he feels worse in a lot of ways, like in terms of being kind of petty and jealous in this movie than he ever did, even pre-character development. And the first one strikes me as very strange.
Yeah, no, like, it just, in so many ways, he just feels like such a wildly different character. And, like, once again, it's never really super detrimental to the movie. It just feels different and not in the best way. Like, it just feels like a slightly worse version of Bob.
It feels like Bob is now played by, like, Kevin James. Like, this is King of Queens or something. Like,
Kevin can wait, if you would.
Yeah, yes, exactly. He's become full schlubby, like, 50s sitcom dad. Whereas Elastigirl feels more like herself. But, you know, I'm still not entirely sure what the deal with her...
With airline food is?
What's the deal with airline food? And also what the main intention of her character arc is. And so I almost feel like in both these movies, Elastigirl, we made that joke about the character being too competent, and I'm wondering if Elastigirl is too competent though, because she makes the mistake of getting captured and falling for the screenslaver ruse, but it's not like she's very obviously, like, buying into it. She's not, like, brought down by her hubris. The whole time she still very much feels like something's not right. And so it feels like, I think the idea between her and the tech lady, the screenslaver, I don't remember her actual name.
Evelyn, I believe.
Evelyn. It feels like there's supposed to be some sort of philosophical difference as far as, like, superheroing goes. And maybe it just feels like, as the result of being a sequel, maybe it just feels less pronounced just because, like, Elastigirl was never as hard on into the pro super thing as her husband was, so that maybe just makes it feel less obvious. But it feels like without that sort of conflict between her and Bob of, like, how does she react into kind of coming into her own and being because we get some scenes, some hinting at it where, like, Bob's, like, struggling, trying to keep the house together, and she's, like, kind of living the life of luxury and like waiting for her next assignment. Like, we get some hints at it, but it's all kind of foreground stuff, and it just never really amounts to much in terms of, like, a real conflict or ideological difference, both in her family and in, like, the villains or even, like, the other supers that she meets.
Yeah, she gets much more of, like, just a conventional superhero arc, and, like, just kind of waylays the conflict and character growth in this one.
Yeah, it's a lot. You know, appropriately, it feels kind of like the plot of like a spy movie. How, like, you know, James Bond, he's never got much of character arc. It's always just more about the actions of uncovering the mystery. Which I could maybe be into, and I'm not gonna rail too hard on this because it's a kids movie, but the mystery is, of course, incredibly obvious.
Did you see the one scene when the brother was shrouded in light and the sister was sitting in the dark and they were next to each other and it was heavy foreshadowing, and I got it. I understood.
Speaking of the sister, I think I finally pinpointed, because in our pre-discussion we talked a little bit about the character designs and how they feel sort of off. Like, a lot of the background animation and all the other stuff that's going on looks good, but the character models are sort of weird, and, like, part of that is just a holdover from when they were designed to be less detailed.
They all kind of look like updated Jimmy Neutron models in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Except for Evelyn. She looks a lot more like a modern Disney character. She looks like, oh god, the one girl from Big Hero 6. I don't remember anything about that movie aside from Baymax, but I think she had, like, roller skates. She had, like, the streak in her hair. She looks kind of like her, and looks very much like a modern Disney character. And
she also kind of looks like the witch from Tangled, actually. Or not the witch, the mother. No, it is a witch in Tangled.
Yeah, oh yeah, like in the face. Yeah, like I can see, but she looks very modern Disney, and everyone else looks very Incredibles. And it's even her brother looks more in line with the rest of the character designs. It's very weird.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'm gonna jump off that though, because I want to talk about like my main feelings about this movie and like what I kind of alluded to a little bit in how it's kind of feels like a rebuttal of criticism of the first movie. And the sister plays a big role in that. If you have listened to our previous episode, you know that we discussed the politics that came through the first movie in how it kind of felt a little Randian, and the Brad Bird influence in that and everything. And I feel like in the 14 years between when the first one came out and when the second one came out, he saw this and kind of went, well, I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief. Because like there's some Twitter posts, like shout outs to my dad who did a bunch of research into this and sent me an article about how Brad Bird presents himself more on the internet and whatnot. I'll throw a link to that in the description down below. But it basically boiled down to he doesn't seem to really buy into the Randian ideals, despite what shows up in his movies. And that's not to say that he doesn't fully buy in. There might be elements of that he does agree with, or it might just be that like he's come across it without really knowing it and input it into his movies. Where this plays into in Incredibles 2 is the screenslaver Evelyn at one point makes a comment about how can we let the costumed heroes tell us what is right and wrong in society, and you know, basically a rebuking of the might makes right, the, you know, they are better than us, therefore they lead us ideals of Randian objectivism and whatnot, and as opposed to kind of being cast in doubt and, you know, looking bad in that moment, Helen kind of is like, you know, you're not wrong, but like it's not for you to decide that this isn't the time, you're not in the position to do that. So in that moment I kind of like, is this just more of a response to the criticism lobbed at the first one? And if so, that doesn't make for a good sequel. Like that's not, like, if you're making a sequel, it's not how do I prove that the ideas that people got from the first movie were wrong. You more so want to like build off the ideas of the first movie or create a new plot, not just to say, no, you're wrong.
It's a very reactionary approach to making a sequel. And it's one that I feel like we've seen a lot of lately between like Batman versus Superman is probably the biggest example of this.
And like there's a big mirror between those two, actually. Because, like, Batman vs. Superman very much underscored that no one died, like, ever. And this movie does pretty much the exact same thing, except it doesn't undo the first movie. It just makes sure that, you know, there were no casualties in Incredibles 2, because they say it, like, 6 times. And, like, even when, at one point, Helen shoots Evelyn in the jetpack with the flare, launches her out of a plane window, and she gets whipped behind them. And I'm like, holy shit, I guess that's where the teeth went. Because, like, that would have been brutal, that would have been memorable, that would have been something to talk about on the Death podcast instead of how no one died. And even, they saved her even in that moment. Which does kind of play into the idea of, like, you know, save everyone, all that good stuff, plus Ultra. But it really just kind of undermine like that moment, because it would have been a very brutal, hardcore death that was really interesting. And they're like, nah, man, we can't kill anyone in this movie. Everyone's safe. The kids, nah, they're definitely not killing anybody. Don't worry about it. No casualties. We promise.
So I got a lot of thoughts. You brought up a lot of good points. So I hope I can keep track of them all. First is that Evelyn, having Helen sort of just sympathize with her, if this is meant to be a rebuking of the first movie, it feels like a half measure at best. It feels very weak. She is still ultimately the villain who has to be overcome, and ultimately we still gotta beat her down in the end and win. And Helen really doesn't have that much of an answer for her. It doesn't feel like. And so
you're not wrong. I'm just gonna quickly interject and say you're not wrong in that it's a half measure, but like it's so pointed that I can't help but feel like it was intentionally put in that way.
No, I mean it definitely is, and it feels like it's definitely addressing the criticisms of the first one. I think in a way you could argue that it's doubling down by presenting it in this way. However, what we are meant to sympathize with Evelyn. She does have a much more sympathetic backstory than Syndrome did, and I feel like that's kind of the other key difference, because on one hand, I miss the teeth. I miss the edge. Like Incredibles 1, I remember like on the rewatch being surprised at how adult it was, because it had been a while since I had watched it. And, like, I mean, it opens, as part of the opening, it features a man's suicide attempt next to a guy named Bon Voyage. It's a very interesting mix of tones, to say the least. So, the thing about Syndrome is that Syndrome got a very memorable death. But Syndrome was also a rat bastard. Just, like, clearly, even if we understood his motivations, he was clearly still, like a piece of shit. And
he's a scumlord.
Yeah. And so watching him get sucked into a jet engine would be satisfying, just because he's clearly such a self-centered, like self-righteous piece of trash. And Evelyn, on the other hand, is fighting like an actual ideological battle. So on the one hand, and one that, again, like, we are clearly sympathetic to. So on the one hand, I do miss the audacity of having your main villain get diced up in a jet turbine. But on the other hand, if Evelyn died hard, that would feel weird. Just based on how sympathetically she's been portrayed. And by extension, the fact that she doesn't have a lot of faceless mooks that the family can grind into the dust, the fact that they are given names, they are other supers who have been like mind controlled. In the logic of the movie, it would also be weird if, like, Dash was like crashing their ships and making them explode again. So I'm of two minds of it, because my gut instinct is to say, Hergel Burgle, like, modern Pixar is so, like, sanded down, and it's lost all of its heart, and its grit, and its soul, and, modern Disney is just pumping out the same movie, but on the other hand, if just the way that the movie is set up, if there was a lot of death, if there was a lot of killing, it would feel even more weird.
I mean, I'm trying to think on this one, because like I'm running through my mind what Screenslaver did and trying to come up with if there was anything in it that would have felt right. I get, like, I don't want to be like, it felt right that this person died in this moment.
I mean, let's call it what it is. We are the lords in the Roman Colosseum. We are like chanting for blood right now.
That is fair. We have in previous episodes been like, yeah, he fucking got killed and it was great, and this is why.
We do run the Death Podcast. We definitely have a grisly streak. That said, I mean, no, I know what you mean though. Like, 'cause I'm thinking in my own head about scenes where maybe it could have maybe a little bit of death could have spiced things up. But like, you know, she couldn't for the false like screenslaver, the pizza guy that Evelyn ends up possessing. Like, you know, couldn't have killed that guy. Like, that poor kid was just a pizza boy. And so much of they're just less. And when I'm thinking about it, they're just less mooks in general. Like, we don't really get mooks until the super show up, and by that point they've already been sort of characterized and we've seen them before, which makes them not okay to kill in movie logic. And otherwise the screenslaver's a lot more like, we're gonna hack into the subway system and, you know, we're gonna have to stop the train instead of like straight up punching a bunch of guys.
And like, for sure it makes sense that like there wouldn't be death in these moments. And like, I'm not necessarily even calling for death to happen like on screen. Like, I don't want to see Void get killed or something. I actually liked her. I thought she was an interesting character. But like, just the number of times that they go, there were no casualties. In the same way that her speech was clearly a very pointed response, it turned into a very pointed response and just drew attention to the fact that no one died is a little weird in the Incredibles universe. Like, it might make sense within this movie, but in just contrast to the first, it feels toothless.
I'm just gonna do what I always do. I'm gonna blame Man of Steel. Fuck Man of Steel for making everyone care about like death in superhero movies. Because that is the clear cutoff point. Man of Steel went full like 9/11, and now suddenly you can't kill mooks and background civvies in superhero movies, and so we always have to have that stupid scene after all this destruction of someone going that like, oh, the casualties were non-existent. We evacuated everybody, and it feels so
Captain America ran the exercise to get people out.
Yeah. It feels so fake. It feels so toothless. And it's entirely Zack Snyder's fault.
Well, let me take a minute then to applaud Civil War for even indicating that there were any casualties at all, because at least that was something.
Civil War, the fact that Civil War almost makes me more mad by the fact that it was they picked like the weakest number possible. Like, it was like in the Battle of New York, like 20 people were killed. Like, really? Like, I've seen car crashes where more people were killed than that. Like, come on, seriously, Civil War? Nah. Anyway.
I mean, at least somebody died in these cataclysms.
At least there were consequences. I will give you that.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I think that's just kind of like my general feeling, though, of the entirety of Incredibles 2, and that it did just feel much more reactionary. And, like, I enjoyed a lot of the movie well enough. Like, it wasn't as special as Incredibles 1. I left the movie kind of, you know, I don't want to say meh. Like, I was definitely better than meh. But, like, it was what I expected it to be. And it will not live up to Incredibles 1. It will probably not be as memorable. And if it weren't for the moments where it was clearly a response to Incredibles 1, it probably wouldn't necessarily... If it weren't for the moments where it was clearly a response to the first Incredibles, I feel like I probably would have enjoyed it more, but like, they just dragged me out every time that they came up, because it was so clearly just like, no casualties, and I'm not a Randian weirdo and everything.
I totally didn't build a city under the sea where only the exceptional are allowed to live. No, I mean...
Would you kindly just forget about all that, please?
Yeah, No, this is another case where I probably sound like, between this and the last podcast, the biggest like hater of the Incredibles movies in the world, even though like the first one is a stone classic. Like, we focused so much on the politics last time, I feel like that got a little bit lost. The first one is like a stone classic, complete and singular and really, really good. This movie is not going to be a stone classic. I'm pretty confident in declaring that. This is the kind of movie, though, where you're flicking through the channels if you're like an old person who still has cable, or like you're scrolling through the Netflix queue and you see it and you're like, oh yeah, that was fun, and then you put it on and you have a smile at some of the wacky stuff. And,
you fold your laundry.
Have a good time. And then you turn it off, and then you kind of forget about it and go about your day. But you had a good time while it was happening. What I will say, though, is that I didn't have a good time because going to a children's movie on opening night is the worst mistake you can possibly make.
You know what? This is like, I went on I went on Father's Day at 2:00, so it was right after the church crowd. I didn't have a terrible time, but like, I'm really happy that your theater experience was worse than mine for once, because it makes me feel a little bit better about all the times that my theater experience sucked.
Yeah, and at least like my theater experience wasn't bad in the profound way that like people clapping, I mean, this is just the classic example of people clapping during The Last Jedi Lightspeed Charge, I think is the like ultimate
I can't believe it.
Yeah, like that actively makes the movie worse. Having a bunch of screaming children next to me didn't make the movie worse. I mean, I didn't appreciate having to like step over the like remains of what looked like a battle between this boy and his popcorn. like I didn't love that.
Oh, that's where the casualties went. Unfortunately, at the end of the movie, all that was left was a bucket of popcorn on the seat and a dead child on the floor.
I can't even finish my thought. Okay. So, also, my theater played the wrong movie, and I had to go tell the ushers to switch it. So there was that too.
Oh yeah, you won this round for the worst theater experience. You win this round. Any closing thoughts?
You know, I've got one more. I've got one more random little thought. Maybe I am being unfair and am just biased by seeing the I mean, I'm sure they played it in all the theaters, but before the film, not the short film, but the little like featurette where they're like, oh, we're so excited after 15 years to bring you The Incredibles 2, and they kind of show all the voice actors. When I saw, I was surprised by how old Bob's voice actor looked, and I didn't expect him. I didn't know who he was, so I didn't know like what he looked like, because Helen's voice actor, I did know who she was, so like, you know, that was,
yeah, she's Holly Hunter. She's pretty well
known. And so like that's not, so like that didn't create any sort of dissonance. It also just like she didn't sound different, but for some reason, like I couldn't help but like feel like Bob sounded like an old man entirely throughout this movie. And
just because you saw that,
no,
I agree. Actually,
like I don't know. Like he definitely sounds. I mean, he definitely sounds different. But like I don't know if I would have like pegged it as him sounding older versus him just like not having done the voice in 15 years. You know?
Yeah. No, I think it hit me too. Actually,
I think it was one of those things where it was like, oh wow, like like that's sort of a surprise. And then like I just couldn't stop, and it was just Bob. Everyone else sounded pretty much how I expected them to. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was.
Well, I have to ask just really quick, and we're gonna keep this real short. What'd you think of Bao?
Bao?
The short beforehand?
Oh, the shorts. I thought it was fine.
I was creeped out by it the entire time.
I thought it was kind of cute.
I was kind of horrified.
Oh, okay.
But when it grew legs and started crying in her mouth, yeah, no, I wasn't big on that one. But
well, you know what? That's fair. Yeah,
I can see where the enjoyment of it would have come from, but I was way too caught up in like the weird.
Well, when she ate him and like went into a deep depression, like that was pretty fucked up.
I swear to God, I thought the whole thing was gonna be about like postpartum depression and like the desire to have their children back inside them and everything.
Yeah,
and like then it's like, nah, he just left the house, and I'm like, then that's just vor. That's just vor.
No, yeah. I thought it was cute.
We can just roll on if we want.
No. It was the short was worth mentioning, just because it was weird, but I kind of dug it because it was weird.
Then with that, I'm going to celebrate this episode because we have multiple young children in it, and neither one of us said derogatory things about them.
Well,
so hey,
I mean, I kind of did.
But like, no, not the children in the audience. I'm talking purely in the movie.
Well. See, this is.
Don't ruin this.
No. I'm gonna use this as an example because I'm not inherently against children in movies. This meme needs to die. Because the children in this movie are actual characters. Because the children in this movie are they're fleshed out, or at least like they were fleshed out in the first movie. Dash is less so in this one. But like Jack. He is just a baby, but also he gets to like preen around like Edna Mode, and he gets to do a bunch of wacky stuff with his powers. So I do not mind Jack's presence at all. And also like he gets to do fun things, and he's just a goofy little scamp, and he's likable.
So yes, we didn't do it this time.
So I don't hate kids. I don't want them all to go away. I promise.
Oh, I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I have a website, isortof.com. I got a bunch of writing up there. I'm doing a bunch of reviews and stuff like that. I did not do one for The Incredibles 2. I've just been busy recently and I did not have time. It's also got links to my Twitch page and everything like that. Go follow me on Twitch. It keeps you updated with what I'm doing. Like last week, I played The Incredibles on the PS2 for like 4 hours, and it was the best movie tie-in game I've played yet, but that's not saying anything.
Considering the illustrious pedigree of what you've been streaming as far as movie tie-in goes, you know, that's I don't know. That's not much of an achievement.
Weirdly enough, they did have both Violet and Dash's voice actors come back, as well as Syndrome and the Piece de Resistance. They had Samuel L. Jackson come back and record some lines as Frozone, and he's like the tutorial dude, so he's just like yelling at you to press buttons, and it's great.
That's amazing. Oh my god.
They didn't have Bob or Helen come back, though. They got new voice actors for them. They apparently could afford Samuel L. Jackson, but not either of them.
Who is Bob? Is he someone I should know?
Oh, he's Craig T. Nelson.
That sounds familiar.
Well, there's a parody Twitter account called Krang T. Nelson.
Well,
he was Adventures in Get Hard.
Brilliant. Did I plug my Twitter yet?
Yeah.
I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller, and I'll fuck, I don't know. Tweet.
As always, huge shout-outs go to Loads of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're on Spotify, all that good stuff. Go check them out. They're a cool band with a bunch of cool people in it. And also shout-outs to 25yearslatersite.com. They do a bunch of stuff with movie reviews, movie analyses, lots of TV reviews. Huge focus on David Lynch over there. And they host us even though we just insinuated that a bucket of popcorn murdered a child in this episode. So... We're on a short leash right now. Next week, we're going to be talking about Jurassic World 2, which, here's a fun game that's come around on Twitter right now. What is the name of Chris Pratt's character?
It's Owen.
Why you and Sam both know that? Why do you know that?
I only remember this because there's a scene in the first one where he's riding the motorcycle and the kids shout it really excitedly. I only remember it because of that. I don't know why I remember that.
She remembered his last name, which I've already forgotten.
Oh, so. Wow. No, I do not know his last name. No, it's Owen because the kids were really happy about him.
So yeah, join us next week for more adventures of Owen Dinosaur Rider, and bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go